In the early 19th century, Afghanistan was not yet a unified state, but a mosaic of tribes and shifting khanates. The British Empire, entrenched in India, and Tsarist Russia expanding southward through Central Asia, viewed the rugged Afghan highlands as a crucial buffer, a chessboard of empire. This strategic rivalry became known as the Great Game, a phrase later popularized by Rudyard Kipling. Each empire feared that the other might use Afghanistan as a corridor for invasion Russia to threaten British India or Britain to contain Russian ambitions. By the 1830s, British strategists saw Afghanistan not for its intrinsic value, but for its geographical position. Whoever influenced Kabul, they reasoned, could block the other empire's path to the Indian plains. In 1839, Britain invaded Afghanistan under the pretext of restoring the deposed Shah Shuja Durrani. The campaign began as a display of imperial confidence and ended in catastrophe. When Afghan tribes revolted in 1841, the British garrison in Kabul was wiped out almost to the last man as it tried to retreat through the snowbound passes to Jalalabad. This failure taught London two lessons. Hebrew 1. Direct occupation of Afghanistan was futile. Hebrew 2. Control would have to be exercised through influence and boundaries, not conquest. After this humiliation, Britain shifted from military domination to strategic boundary management, carving lines on maps that would later harden into borders. By the late 1870s, Russia had moved deeper into Central Asia, annexing Turkestan and approaching the Afghan frontier. Alarmed, Britain launched a second invasion of Afghanistan in 1878. After heavy fighting, the Treaty of Gandamak 1879 gave Britain control over Afghan foreign affairs, effectively making Afghanistan a buffer protectorate. Now Britain could not afford a hostile Afghanistan, but neither could it rule it directly. So British officers, geographers, and surveyors began drawing borders that would contain Russia and stabilize tribal frontiers, often without consulting those who lived there. In 1893, British Foreign Secretary Sir Mortimer Durand met Amir Abdur-Rahman Khan in Kabul. Their discussions produced one of the most consequential boundary agreements in South Asian history, the Durand Line. Stretching roughly 2,640 kilometers, it divided Pashtun tribal lands between British India and Afghanistan. The stated goal was administrative clarity. The reality was imperial containment. No one consulted the tribal elders whose valleys and grazing routes the line bisected. Families, clans, and trade routes suddenly found themselves citizens of two different empires. While Abdur-Rahman accepted the line under pressure, calling it a line of friendship, he viewed it as temporary. Britain, however, treated it as permanent. This mismatch in interpretation still fuels the Afghanistan-Pakistan border dispute today. Beyond official treaties, Britain also engaged in local-level pacts with tribal leaders. These were often unwritten or classified, but they formed the real foundation of frontier control. Frontier allowances tribes were paid to guard passes, roads, or telegraph lines, creating a system of tribal stipends. Boundary commissions, British surveyors negotiated small adjustments with local maliks, chiefs, marking ridges and rivers with cairns or stone pillars. Divide and manage, rival tribes were deliberately given overlapping spheres of influence to prevent alliances that could threaten British India. These micro-agreements shaped the frontier as much as any treaty did. The borders on paper masked a complex web of local autonomy and informal governance. The British Northwest Frontier Province NWFP, created in 1901, became the laboratory of imperial frontier policy. Rather than strict border enforcement, Britain ruled indirectly through political agents, Qasadars tribal police, and collective tribal punishment laws. In practice, the frontier was not a line, it was a band of shifting influence, stretching from Peshawar's plains to the Afghan foothills. This semi-autonomous region blurred the meaning of sovereignty. To the British, it was a buffer. To the tribes, it was ancestral land. To the Emir of Kabul, it was part of the Afghan nation unjustly divided. When British India was partitioned in 1947, Pakistan inherited the Durand Line, but Afghanistan refused to recognize it as an international border. Afghan governments argued that the 1893 agreement had expired with the end of British rule. The newly formed Pakistan insisted it was binding. The border remains disputed to this day, and the tribal divisions Britain engineered continue to shape local politics, insurgencies, and identities across the frontier. The Great Game's temporary boundaries became permanent wounds. For the frontier tribes, the Afridi, Wazir, Shinwari, Mohmand, and others, the 19th century boundary manipulations were not abstract diplomacy. They lost seasonal grazing routes, traditional trade corridors, and kinship ties. Their villages became checkpoints in someone else's geopolitical strategy. Even today, many Pashtuns along the border see themselves as one people divided by a foreign line. Abrakhur's A Great Game may have been an imperial rivalry, but its local impact was deeply human, altering the social fabric of entire communities. Modern Afghanistan's conflict, Soviet invasion, Taliban rise, U.S. intervention, all unfolded within boundaries first drawn during the Great Game. The terrain of imperial rivalry became the terrain of global geopolitics. Britain's 19th century map-making exercise had defined the stage on which the 20th and 21st centuries would play out. The Great Game was not just a diplomatic rivalry, it was a cartographic act of empire that turned tribal landscapes into state borders. Where Britain saw lines of defense, the people living there saw lines of division. Afghanistan's modern boundaries, and the tensions they still hold, are the living echoes of 19th century British policy, drawn by men who never imagined their maps would still define a nation's fate more than a century later.